My name is Michael Santoro, and I'm a professor of business ethics at Rutgers. And like many people in the room, I also teach courses in business and human rights and corporate social responsibility. And it is my pleasure today to introduce Professor Lynn A. Stout, the Distinguished Professor of Corporate and Business Law at Cornell Law School. Professor Stout's groundbreaking work in corporate governance, financial regulation, and ethics is well known and admired by business school faculty as well as by her colleagues in law. Professor Stout is a summa cum laude graduate of Princeton and a former senior editor of the Yale Law Journal. But what I found most impressive about Professor Stout, however, is that she has been unafraid in her scholarship to take on some of the most prominent shibboleths of corporate law, and in her own career to uphold the highest personal ethical standards. Her 2011 book, Cultivating Conscience: How Good Laws Make Good People, criticizes the Homo economicus assumption of rational selfishness. Relying on modern behavioral science research showing that people often sacrifice their own material welfare to help or avoid harming others, Professor Stout describes how tort, contract, and criminal law can be reformed to harness the force of conscience, not just material incentives, and encourage cooperative, ethical, and law-abiding behavior. As reported in the New York Times in 2011, Professor Stout, then at UCLA, publicly protested after UCLA named a business law center after a donor of $10 million who had been banned from the securities industry and barred from the New York Stock Exchange. Professor Stout wrote a letter to the UCLA chancellor, and this is what she said. She said in protest, "I have devoted my career to arguing for investor protection and honest and ethical behavior in business." In recent years, Professor Stout's work on shareholder primacy has attracted international attention. Her most recent book, The Shareholder Value Myth, builds on a distinguished scholarly career at the intersection of law and economics. Her 2009 Virginia Law Review article on, it was 19.
It was 1999.
1999, I thought I had that wrong. Her 1999 article in Virginia Law Review on the team production theory of corporate law is the 8th most cited article of all time in all of corporate and securities law. It was cited in Justice Stevens' dissent in Citizens United versus FEC. To even briefly try to summarize all of Professor Stout's honors, awards, and leadership positions would take away too much time from the pleasure of hearing her speak. So without further ado, I give you Professor Lynn A. Stout.
For that kind introduction. I wish my mom were here. All right, so this is a talk that I've given, I think, 50 times because I love to give this talk to people like you, because I understand we're all busy, right? And it's actually the most efficient way to communicate and to have a discussion over these ideas. And you are the kind of folks who are, in a position to understand the magnitude of the issues, the nature of the problem, and to carry on the discussion. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you so much, Anthony in particular, for sending an email several months ago. All right, so I come from the world of corporate governance more than the world of human rights per se. But I think we can both agree this is the kind of corporate behavior we don't like, right? This is not good, blowing up the Gulf of Mexico. What caused BP to basically instigate the largest discrete environmental disaster in history? I say discrete because, of course, climate change is probably the largest human-caused environmental disaster in history. There was a congressional committee that was tasked to try and discover what the causes of the Deepwater Horizon disaster were, that concluded that BP, not only on this occasion, but for several years, had been systematically cutting safety corners in the interest of keeping costs down in exploring and developing offshore and onshore oil sources. However, I think the cause actually is something still deeper than just BP's cost cutting. I think the cause was actually an idea, a bad idea. And by bad, I think I mean bad in both senses. It's both normatively a bad idea and also positively a bad or incorrect idea. And that idea is something I've come to call the shareholder value myth or shareholder value ideology. So there it is. It's up on the board. I don't need to read it to you. You can read it for yourself. You're probably familiar with this ideology. You've probably, read this, been told this, had someone argue it to you, maybe with the veins bulging in their forehead as they explain to you why corporations shouldn't be concerned about human rights. All right. It's wrong, and if you want to go to the details, this is the book I wrote about it a couple years ago. And it's designed to be readable on an airplane, 110 pages, fairly large type, because again, I'm not necessarily interested in talking only to academics. I'm interested in talking to anyone who is involved in the business world who is concerned about this problem, or for that matter, anyone outside the business world who's concerned about this problem, and I think that's probably most of us. Okay. So before I get started, I do want to make a basic point, and this will be particularly salient to the law professors in the group, but the basic point is that not all corporations are alike. And one of the most significant variables or spectra along which they differ is the extent to which shareholders control them. Now, at one extreme, you have the unusual corporation that has a single shareholder. That is a corporation where shareholders enjoy a lot of control. And it's probably, it's still legally incorrect, but probably not particularly damaging to refer to a company like this as being, quote, owned by its sole shareholder. However, as we move along the spectrum, you'll see there are probably many more corporations, and certainly many more of the largest corporations, that do not have a single shareholder or even a shareholder who's a controlling shareholder. Most of our largest corporations are nonprofit corporations and public companies with dispersed share ownership. This is the pattern that you see in Asia and in Europe to a certain extent, but I'm going to focus for the moment over here on nonprofit organizations and especially on my favorite kind of corporation, the Fortune 500 corporation. You know, the one that controls $40 trillion and probably is the single largest source of employment for certainly, or at least was for Americans, and still employs lots of people today. Okay, so when I talk about the shareholder value myth, it's these companies that I'm going to be focusing on because they're the ones where the myth is most powerful and is most likely to have an effect. And what are those effects? Well, what we're seeing with our large Fortune 500 companies is that, first of all, what's happened is that the world of corporate law and practice has changed very dramatically over the past 30 years. I was actually just talking about this with Michael. People think that a lot of the changes we've seen in corporations are driven by market forces. And to some extent this is true, but they've been driven more by a series of marginally easy to overlook, but collectively fundamental changes in tax law, pension law, and securities law that have had the following effects. Effect number one, we now have large institutions, mutual funds and pension funds, many of which were created because they enjoy tax subsidies, that now have a lot more political power. And that's because of a bunch of SEC rule changes, among other things, including the 1992 change in the proxy rules, which basically made it possible for activist hedge funds to coordinate with other investors. So that's sort of what created the activist hedge fund that we've heard so much about. It's not something that evolved from market forces. It evolved because we changed the legal rules to make that possible. The other change we've seen, another really critical change, occurred in 1993 when Congress amended the tax code to require companies to tie executive pay to a so-called objective metric in order to get full tax deductibility of compensation paid to executives. anything over $1 million was not a tax deduction unless it was tied to an objective performance metric. Well, guess what the metric was that everybody picked? First it was stock options, then it was restricted stock. Now it's some version generally of so-called total shareholder return. But the focus is very much on how much money is going into the pocket of shareholders right now. So in addition to having all these shareholders out there who have more power than they've ever enjoyed in business history, now we have CEOs who are directly incentivized to have the same interests as the relatively short-term shareholders. Oh, some of the other changes, we eliminated the system of fixed brokerage commissions, got rid of our stock transaction tax, and as a result, the holding period for corporate shares went from 8 years in 1960 to 4 months today. So we have more powerful shareholders, they're more short-term shareholders, their interests are aligned with CEOs. And the other thing that's happened is we've had an entire generation of business leaders who've been trained up in shareholder value ideology, including me. This is what I taught my students for the first 10 years of my career. Why not? Right? Everybody else was saying this was true, and it seemed sensible enough on the surface. It's only when you get below the surface and start to look more carefully that you discover that it doesn't make sense, which may explain why the more we embrace this idea, the worse results we seem to be getting out of our public corporations. So here are some of the facts on the ground. First of all, our public companies are disappearing. From over 9,000 about 15 years ago, it was actually over 9,000 around 1998, to only over 4,000 today. The life expectancy of public companies has been cut almost by 3/4, from 50 to 60 years in the middle of the 20th century to only 15 years. The average Fortune 500 company is on the Fortune 500 list for only 15 years. And at this point, my friends from the University of Chicago tend to jump up and down and start quoting Schumpeter and saying it must be creative destruction. And I say, well, if it were so creative, don't you think shareholders should actually be getting more value out of all this destruction? Apparently not. So Roger Martin at the Rotman School in Toronto has done a calculation. I've done a different calculation. James Montier, in a very influential white paper that was posted by the CFA Institute, did another version of the calculation. We're all finding the same thing, which is that the returns from owning public equities are down. This is the reason, by the way, that so many pension funds are desperately searching for so-called alternative investments, because they can't get the returns they need from public equity. And finally, I don't have a good source for this figure, so if someone can give it to me, I'd appreciate it. I've just seen it repeated in so many newspaper stories, I'm willing to share it with you. And the figure says that where 20 or 30 years ago, the typical public company reinvested 40% of its profits or more back into the business, today that figure is less than 10%. Almost all corporate profits go for share repurchases and for dividends. Okay, so we've been embracing shareholder value as a norm. We've been changing our tax law, our pension law, our securities law to encourage it. These are the results we're getting. Why? Because it is ideology, and when you look at it, it turns out it's based on error all the way through. It's a castle built on a foundation of sand. It's inconsistent with business history, it's inconsistent with the law, it's inconsistent with good economics, I'll explain that in a minute, and it's also inconsistent with the available evidence. And I've been saying this now for 10 years, and 10 years, I've been saying it for 10 years in a sophisticated fashion, I've been saying it for 3 years in a really loud public fashion. I'm waiting for someone to stand up and publicly explain what I've missed, right? It's very interesting. The people who love shareholder primacy don't cite me, don't discuss me, don't cite anything. They just cite each other. They don't cite case law or evidence or anything. They just say, oh, some other Chicago school person said this 20 years ago, so it must be true. So I invite them. If there's anyone who thinks I'm getting any of this wrong, I would love to have them appear with me at the front of the room on any occasion. Seabiscuit will meet War Admiral on any track in any conditions. Okay. History. Okay, just to help you remember, this was not the way things have always been. Shareholder value maximization was not brought down by Moses on a tablet. For most of the 20th century, American public companies followed a philosophy called managerialism or managerial capitalism, and their directors and executives, who were, by the way, paid very little by today's standards, viewed themselves as stewards or trustees of great institutions that were supposed to serve not only investors, who, as I pointed out, actually did better under this system, but they were also supposed to serve their customers, their employees, the nation, society as a whole. So shareholder primacy really gets its traction in the 1970s and the 1980s with the writings of Milton Friedman, the famous Chicago School economist. His ideas get taken up by Michael Jensen in Michael Jensen's Theory of the Firm, the single most cited article in the managerial literature. What I'm going to explain in a minute, but Milton and Mike Jensen never went to law school. And that might be why they never quite understood what a corporation was. I'll talk a little bit about what it is. But the main point is, we know that it's perfectly possible to run corporations according to a different philosophy quite successfully, because it's happened here in the past, and it's happening today all around us in other parts of the world. Okay, so history does not support the view. I'm actually not aware of any corporate sector or jurisdiction at any time where public companies were run according to shareholder value maximization that actually survived and thrived, now that I think of it. The counterexamples are all in the other direction. Okay, the law. So this is the part I like the best, because this really is my day job, and I really am an expert on this. And I am here to tell you that the idea that the law requires corporate executives to maximize profits or share price is a total myth, because of this wonderful doctrine called the business judgment rule. And what the business judgment rule says, and it is the most important doctrine in corporate law, arguably, and what it says is that as long as the directors of the company are not taking the company's assets for themselves, as long as they're so-called independent, it's not an interested transaction, then any decision they make about how to run the company is going to be upheld by the court as long as they just get up there and say the following words: in good faith, I believe this was in the best long-run interest of the corporation. All you have, and by the way, let me point out, that's a completely unfalsifiable claim in the vast majority of cases. So if you're a director and you get up there and you say, Your Honor, I in good faith believe that this business strategy, that taking care of my employees, refraining from polluting, giving charitable donations, investing in R&D, I thought these things were all in the best interest of the company. You are, bingo, safe, right? Ali Ali, oxen-free, no legal problems. It's fascinating to me where this myth that there's a legal duty to maximize profits or shareholder value came from. When you ask anyone to cite authority for that proposition, you generally get one of two responses. One, they cite a 100-year-old case from the state of Michigan called Dodge versus Ford, which wasn't about directors' duties at all. It was about a controlling shareholder exploiting a minority shareholder. Even Delaware courts today don't cite Dodge versus Ford for anything other than majority shareholders should not exploit minority shareholders in a closely held company. The other case they cite is a case called Revlon. And Revlon is an interesting exception to the business judgment rule that I think proves the rule. So what Revlon says is that, and I'm doing this, you business people can yawn, that's okay. This is for the law professors in the crowd. What Revlon says is that if you've got a public company that the directors have decided to sell to a controlling shareholder, a transaction that essentially kicks the existing shareholders out of the firm, whether they want to go or not, they're being forced to sell their shares. And that means, by the way, also the directors are about to come under the control of this new controlling shareholder. In that one situation, directors do have an enforceable duty to try and get the highest possible price for the shareholders who are being kicked out of the firm, because it's being sold to a new person who's going to be in a position to either keep or get rid of the board of directors. That's the only situation, and interestingly enough, there's no legal obligation to sell the company to a controlling shareholder if you don't want to. So what you look at when you look at real corporate law is that there is no duty to maximize shareholder value or profits, and Exhibit A, one of my favorite recent cases out of Delaware, Air Products versus Airgas. Airgas was trading at $40 to $50 a share. Air Products came along, wanted to buy the company for $70 a share. That sounds like maximizing shareholder value, doesn't it? The board of directors of Airgas said, we don't want to sell, go away. And the Delaware court said, that decision's fine. You're protected by the business judgment rule. Yeah, so much for this legal duty to maximize shareholder value. Okay, good economics. So here's the problem. I mentioned it already. Milton Friedman and Mike Jensen never went to law school. And so they didn't really know what a corporation was. They thought it was some sort of maybe gigantic sole proprietorship. Okay, so law professors help out the business school professors. What is a corporation? It is a legal person. It is not a fiction. Sure, it's invisible, but so is gravity, right? They're both powerful forces, corporations and gravity. It's a legal person. And what that means is, number one, shareholders don't own corporations. Shareholders own shares, which are a contract between the shareholder and the legal person known as the corporation. Employees also have employment contracts with corporations. Creditors also have debt contracts with corporations. But there's no unique legal status that shareholders enjoy that somehow makes them the owners of the company. A more sophisticated argument that you'll frequently see, advanced especially in finance classes, is that the shareholders are the so-called residual claimants in the corporation, meaning the corporation pays out the taxes it has to pay, it pays out the salaries it's agreed to pay, it pays out the interest it has to pay on its outstanding debt, and then the shareholders are the residual claimants who get everything that's left over. I mean, I don't know, but I can assure you, every corporate finance course I took, every finance theory course I took, every finance textbook I've looked at says this same thing. It's erroneous. You know who the residual claimant in a corporation is? A healthy corporation, not one that's being dismembered? The corporate entity. Remember, it's a legal person. What that means is that the corporation actually owns the corporation's profits. What does it do with those profits? Whatever the board of directors thinks it should do with those profits. So it may pay out some of the profits to dividends. By the way, feel free to use this the next time you talk to a finance professor who gives you the residual claimants argument. So if you're looking for arrows to put in your quiver, borrow as many as you like. But in any case, corporations are their own residual claimants. The finance construct that shareholders are is erroneous, with the exception of a firm that is being liquidated in bankruptcy, which is pretty much a dead firm. And the legal rules that apply to living firms are quite different from the legal rules that apply to dead firms. Okay, and finally, when we get to evidence. So this is an interesting area that I could spend an hour on in and of itself. But when you look for evidence that running companies according to the mantra of maximize shareholder value produces better results even for shareholders, that evidence turns out to be shockingly weak. So typically, it's tested in one of two ways. So one of the things you can do is you compare the performance of companies that have governance structures that supposedly are friendlier to shareholders. So for example, one share, one vote is supposed to be better for shareholders than a dual class structure where some subgroup of shareholders has all of the voting power. So for example, Google has bad corporate governance because Google's got two classes of shares and the firm's founders and top executives have the class that has all the votes. But when we do empirical tests to see whether or not firms that have dual classes actually perform more poorly than one share, one vote, some studies find they perform more poorly, other studies find they perform better. Overall, there doesn't seem to be any reliable and replicated result. The other thing you can do is you can look at what happens when companies change from a supposedly shareholder unfriendly governance structure to a more shareholder-oriented governance structure. Say, for example, by getting rid of a staggered board. And again, the studies are all over the map. So, it used to be thought that getting rid of a staggered board would actually increase value. A study just came out in Stanford Law Review a couple months ago. Apparently that's not true. So the empirical evidence is all over the place. And some of it, by the way, is really bad. The single most cited article on whether good governance produces better results is a study by Paul Gompers and Ishii. It's probably some of you have run into it, and it's been cited thousands of times in the literature. They created something they called the Gompers-Ishii Index, and they said that firms that were high on the Gompers Issue Index had good corporate governance. That was they were the shareholder democracy firms, I believe they labeled them, and that firms that were low on shareholder democracy were at the low end of the governance index, and they decided to compare the performance of the firms in the top decile with the firms at the bottom decile. Now, it's been a long time since I took statistics, but when I took it, I was told to discount outliers. Their result is driven by outliers. Remember, this is the single most cited study out there. Result is driven by outliers, and it gets worse than that. It turns out that in the shareholder democracy portfolio, the result was driven by two companies, Walmart and Berkshire Hathaway, which apparently turned out to be shareholder democracy companies because they didn't control for the presence of a controlling shareholder. Will someone please repeat that? How did this happen? How did the most cited study on corporate governance ever get published where in calculating whether or not the firm was characterized by shareholder democracy, they neglected to control for the presence of a controlling shareholder? But in any case, all of those studies, I would suggest, are looking in the wrong place. What they're trying to do is test the best way to run corporations by looking at what happens to one single corporation at one moment in time or compared to other single corporations. But of course, most shareholders, and certainly most human beings, are interested in the performance of the corporate sector as a whole over time, right? And if that's what you're interested in, maybe we should be looking at what happens to the performance of the corporate sector as a whole over time. And there, as I've already pointed out, the picture isn't so good, is it? And the problem is a little bit like what happens when you ask a typical economist to go test the best method for fishing. So if we send our economist out to test the best method for fishing, and she goes to a fishing village, she notices that some fishermen are using nets and some are using dynamite. And she notices that the fishermen who use dynamite get more fish. And she also notices that fishermen who switch from nets to dynamite get more fish after they switch. And so our economist would say, everybody should fish with dynamite. My fear is that something like that is going on in our corporate sector, that we've got a bunch of newly created, powerful, relatively short-term investors who are investing with dynamite. And, of course, this is the result you get. Okay, I'm going to go back and run through this pretty quickly because I want more time for Q&A. But it turns out that you can understand why this strategy is working out so badly by understanding that where corporations are, in fact, quite real, invisible but real, the thing that we think of as a shareholder turns out to be what's actually a fiction. Because in shareholder value ideology, the shareholder is this platonic entity out there floating around that cares about only one thing, right? They care about what's happening to the stock price of the firm that they own. Of course, that platonic entity doesn't exist. Shares of companies in real life are owned by real people, either directly or more commonly through an institutional interest in a mutual fund or a pension fund. And real people turn out to have stakes in lots of things above and beyond the share price of a single company. And what that means is you can, in fact, have no single shareholder value because different shareholders have different values. And so what I put up on the board is some of the conflicts that actually frequently arise between the human beings that own shares, conflicts between and among themselves that make it impossible to have a unitary shareholder value. I'll just talk about a couple of them. Actually, I'll do the first and the last. But the first one's kind of interesting. There was a time back in the 1980s when people were enamored of this economic theory called the efficient market hypothesis. And they liked a particularly strong version of the efficient market hypothesis that said that stock market prices always accurately reflect the value of companies. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, we're grown-ups now. We don't believe in Santa Claus. And you can't even find a finance theorist under the age of 50 who will tell you that the stock market also always accurately values companies, which means that there is a conflict between the interests of short-term investors who care only about that stock price and would be happy to have it be raised by doing things that harm long-term value because they're going to sell and get out, and the interest of the longer-term investor. And it's interesting, if you look at what activist hedge funds typically actually ask for, first of all, we've got data. Activist hedge funds will tell you, the hedge fund managers will tell you that they're long-term shareholders and that they're improving corporate governance and unlocking shareholder value. This is what the data says. On average, they hold their shares for 24 months. Now, you can call that long-term, but I couldn't even get my kid through orthodontia in 24 months, right? And it also turns out that their idea of unlocking shareholder value is always one of three things, and I mean always. They always want you to either borrow a lot of money so you can pay a big dividend or go forward with a big share repurchase program, or they want you to cut payroll, R&D, and other expenses so you can make the company look like it's got higher accounting profits, or they want you to sell all or part of it and take advantage of the premium that you typically get thanks to the lovely thing known as the winner's curse. And the problem is, when companies are doing these things, they're often undermining their own long-run health. But the activist hedge funds don't care because they only own 2 or 3 positions. They're going to sell and get out and move on to the next target. Unfortunately, those of us who want to retire and want to have a diversified portfolio do care when this happens because we see the shrinking pool of public companies and lower returns because they're not investing in R&D. Then this one is great for you folks, pro-social versus psychopathic investors. The first book that Michael mentioned, Cultivating Conscience, was actually, I'm really amazed you knew about that. No one's read that book. I love that book, but apparently I'm the only one who loves that book. It hasn't sold that much. It's a real academic book. But I love the book because in writing it, I had to do an enormous amount of research on human behavior, from life sciences to experimental evidence to evolutionary theory, the whole shebang. And I learned something really cool. And the cool thing is, most of us are actually pretty decent human beings. Meaning, we might not, if you walk by a homeless person on the street, you might not put money in his cup, but you're probably not going to take the money out and run off. Right? So it turns out that there's actually good data. 97% of the population typically is pro-social, meaning they will make at least some sacrifice to follow ethical rules and to avoid harming others. Sometimes they will even sacrifice to help others. And of course, you know what we call the other 3%, right? They're called psychopaths. It's really interesting. Their brains are wired different. You can see the difference on brain scanning. The brain scanning studies show the difference. So if 97% of us are not psychopaths, I'm optimistic that maybe 80-90% of investors also aren't psychopaths. And they are the ones who are not going to want companies to maximize shareholder value, and this is done by imposing severe external costs on other people, when it's done by destroying the species, destroying the health of the ecosystem, when it's caused by damaging workers, or any of the things that a non-psychopathic person doesn't want to profit from. Okay. But what happens when we recognize all of these different shareholder interests and we turn to managers and we say, we're going to tie your pay to stock price? What have we just done with all these shareholder conflicts? We have solved them by telling managers that they should serve the interests only of the very small subset of shareholders who is the most short-term, the most opportunistic, and the most consciousnessless, and most indifferent to ethical rules and to human and to harming other people. In other words, we basically demanded that our managers run companies according to the desires of the lowest common denominator of humanity. You might even say the lowest common subhuman denominator. Okay, so I'm just about done here. I just want to point out, it doesn't have to be this way. Turns out there's a ton of changes. Just as it took a whole bunch of changes to get us where we are today, there's a whole bunch of things we can do going forward. I've put a few of them up on the board. But it all starts, of course, with recognizing that shareholder value ideology is just that, ideology, and it's not the way things have to be. All right, so thank you very much for your patience, and I would be delighted to take comments and questions from the floor, and maybe Anthony and Mike can help me and call on people for me.
questions? Let's see. Let's begin with you, Ursula.
Yeah, I was wondering what you think of the whole B Corp thing. I mean, did we need to even create that, and does that even reinforce these kind of ideas by creating it?
Oh, great question. So I have mixed feelings about B Corps. Oh, so the question is, what about the B Corp phenomena? And does, in fact, all the attention that's been paid to B Corps, in fact, maybe worsen shareholder value ideology? My theory is that yes, it does, in part because the folks at B Labs, when they first began with that project, made a pretty big deal about claiming that C corporations had to, as a legal matter, maximize their profits. I think they've gotten much more careful about making that claim, in part because I've confronted them a couple of panels about it. But no, I think they've come to realize you don't want to do more damage than good. And by perpetuating the myth that C corporations have to be run in a profit-maximizing fashion, they do run that risk. The other concern I have about B corporations is, for a variety of reasons, it's highly unlikely you're going to see it widely adopted. And it's certainly not going to be widely adopted by the massive C corporations that already dominate our economy, that are the single largest economic force on the planet, and that I think we really need to be paying a lot of attention to what's going on at the C corporation level. But that said, there is a positive side to B Corps, which is that B corporations do have to be certified, and this creates a demand for third-party providers to come along with good certifications and metrics for non-financial performance. And that's really key. One of the drivers, I think, of shareholder value maximization is the fact that it's almost a historical accident. When we first instigated mandatory disclosure for public corporations in the 1930s, we weren't that concerned about human rights and about external costs, and there's actually reason to think companies didn't actually necessarily even pose as great a threat in terms of external costs. So that, plus the Great Depression, made the regulatory structure focus only on financial reporting. And that's what's been sort of historically established out there. And it's hard to get someone to incur the cost of devising non-financial metrics if there isn't someone who's willing to pay them for that service. So that's the positive side to B Labs. And I think that's the side that I certainly would be happy to promote and to praise.
A lot of people who want to come in.
Okay, I'm trying to shorten my answers.
Sure.
Erica,
I was
if you
going
might
to do the B-Lab question, but I have a different, I'll ask a
Can you also
different
introduce,
question.
maybe just say...
I'm Erica George. I'm a professor at law at the University of Utah. I'm a human rights lawyer who has become self-educated now on corporate law. So I'm new to this sphere, and I use your book in my class. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
So there has been, the head of the Delaware Chancery Court has made some very biting comments about investors that claim to be interested in integrated reporting and investing beyond the bottom line. So there was his comments in response to CalPERS, who is now saying we're socially responsible investors. I'm at a university that's now very interested in socially responsible investing. And when you have the head of the court that is most cited for what business is supposed to be about, it's seeming to send the signal that socially responsible investing is not to be taken seriously. So I wonder if you have thoughts on how to counter that kind of narrative and where that's occurring in the academy or elsewhere.
Yeah, this is a very, I know exactly who you're speaking of. I will be debating that person in Delaware in November on that topic. But I'll tell you, what is the slide I'm looking for? Where's my business judge room? Here we go. Even that judge, where's my, two, look at two. I can't use my pointer anymore. There we go. Even that judge still applies the business judge rule. So I don't know what to say other than I don't understand the point of that rhetoric. It seems to me to be not based in case law, and it's kind of an awkward thing to look at a judge and say, why are you saying something in public that's totally different from the way you actually decide your cases? Because I can assure you all the Delaware chancellors still decide their cases according to the business judgment rule. Air products versus air gas was a Delaware case. So I don't know what to say about that one judge, except I wouldn't hesitate to if you were to say, run into that person, just ask him, have you stopped to think about the message you're sending? Part of it may just be that, we've had so many years of people being taught this ideology, and all the top all the top students at all the top business schools, economics departments, law schools were taught this. People internalize these ideas and may not even recognize that their behavior is completely inconsistent with what they think the model of the world says the world should be.
Okay.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you?
I'm Bennett Freeman, and
Yeah.
I'm going to build on Erica's good question and try to ask it a different way based on my perspective for nine years until 2 weeks ago as senior vice president of the largest SRI firm in the U.S., Shareholder Conflicts. And that's to say that your natural constituency, your natural allies, are not just the traditional SRIs, but the growing number of so-called responsible investors in the U.S.
Yeah.
And a lot of big institutional asset managers, J.P. Morgan Chase, UBS, others are now doing so-called ESG investing. Yet, as you point out, very few are willing to challenge this dominant ideology, this myth, as you put it, the shareholder value. I'm one of the few who did. I spoke by video at that European Parliament thing last year.
Oh, that was great. Yeah.
And you were at
That's right.
was
I
me.
saw your face on the screen.
That's right.
Thank
But
you.
my point in mentioning that is that most SRIs and other responsible investors have been afraid to stand up and be counted, as I was on behalf of Calvert, because they worry about playing into the perception that responsible investment means subpar returns.
Right.
And while you're putting forward a much more complicated argument, there is a political and just a business worry about getting into that debate, which does not historically play well for SRIs. So my question is how do we deal with that quandary when, in fact, you should be pushing on an open door, but you're not with your natural supporters, at least not from where I sit. Or sat.
Yeah. This is such an thank you for your talk last year, which I did get to view, and thank you for that very difficult question. So we do know that most people are pro-social, and if you want any further evidence of it, look at the fact that in Canada now more than 13% of all professionally managed assets are in some sort of either screening or impact fund status, and it's maybe 9 or 10% in the United States and growing. It's the fastest growing investment segment is the responsible investing segment. I'm going to use that as the broad term. But it creates an issue for people who want to basically sell socially responsible or impact funds. And the issue is, what do you do with the question of whether it's going to cost people anything? Right now, the industry seems to be addressing that issue by trying to argue that you may actually make more money by investing in a socially responsible fashion. I don't actually know if that's true. But my look at the data has persuaded me that if you do lose money, you only lose a little tiny bit. And so, as a pro-social person, that's all you need to tell me. You don't actually need to, a psychopath will go for sustainable investing or ethical investing if they're going to make more money. But the other 97% of us, you don't have to do that. You just have to tell us we're not going to lose too much. So that was one of the other things I learned when I was studying human pro-socialities. We're mostly pro-social, but not if it's going to cost us a huge amount. But we're willing to take a little bit of a hit. And so the other interesting thing I learned is that when you emphasize selfish reasons for doing things, you actually change human behavior and thinking. When we emphasize extrinsic rewards, people start to use different pathways in the brain, and their behavior becomes more selfish. So I've always wondered if instead of trying to argue that you'll make the same or more money, the ethical investing industry shouldn't be saying, we're not sure, you might make more, but the main thing we're pretty confident of is if you make less, it's only a little bit less, and this is what you ought to do. Not only if you're a responsible person who cares about something other than your own material welfare, this is something you ought to do even if you're a rational person and you recognize that your material welfare is not only determined by your stock portfolio, but it's also determined by whether you keep your job, whether the products you buy as a consumer are untainted, whether the air you breathe is clean. So I've often, maybe we should have a talk about this, because I've often wondered what the best strategy would be for the industry. And I've wondered.
Happy to. There are ways of getting at it.
Yeah. I mean, but so thank you for giving me an opportunity to muse over. But I actually don't have a view. Your view is better than mine on that one.
Thank you for that.
Nina Gardner, I do advising companies on corporate sustainability, but I teach business and human rights at Johns Hopkins in Washington. I'm fascinated by this whole subject too, and see that that's sort of a way to drive change. Could you talk a little bit and link to this whole idea of business judgment rule, fiduciary duty? I'm wondering whether at a certain point we can get the definition of fiduciary duty to change from board of directors to actually be in dereliction of their fiduciary duty if they don't take the ESG criteria into consideration. I think that would sort of be a sea change in terms of the whole sort of idea of maximizing profit. That's the only way to do it, because oh my God, that would get people to get to really look into the ESG as we do.
My answer, I think, will be a little disappointing to you, but it's based on the study of business law history and the study of corporate governance structures around the world. And what you find over and over and over again is that the only thing that typically courts will find directors personally liable for or accountable for is taking corporate assets for themselves. So the duty of loyalty is the only fiduciary duty that really has teeth. And that's been true for hundreds of years. Now, when I see a legal rule that's that widespread and that long, persists that long, part of me says, there's a reason for that. And there's a lot of people who will give you lots of good reasons why you don't want to make it easy to sue directors over disagreements in judgment. This is sort of the theory behind the business judgment rule. So I'm not very positive on that as a potential solution. But what I do think is that we should stop to recognize that, in fact, even if we can't give directors positive reason to focus on a broader version of what is truly valuable to society, including the people who own your shares, at the very least we can get rid of all the problems we've created that drive them in the other direction. So, for example, I think compensating directors with stock or stock options is a dreadful idea. And the shareholders of Enron would probably agree with me. Right? That's a dreadful idea. I think that not allowing companies to have takeover defenses that will insulate them from activist hedge funds is a bad idea. I think takeover defenses, staggered boards, and the like should be permissible, especially when they're in the corporate charter. Nobody makes someone buy stock in a company that has takeover defenses. If you really think it's that bad idea, don't buy it. I think we can change some of the tax rules that favor share repurchases, some of the SEC rules that favor share repurchases over reinvestment in the business. So I would focus less on adding more sticks and more on getting rid of the sticks we have that are driving boards in the wrong direction.
First, I'd like to recommend a lot of Lynn's work I used to use in my corporate governance class. Students really found it accessible and easy, both a lot of the articles and the books. Second is a quick comment and a question to make sure that people use benefit corporation when you're talking about the entity that is sanctioned by the state. That's a separate corporate legal entity, and BCorp is what's certified by BLab. So kind of corporate professors, their teeth go on edge when people say a BCorp because it's a completely separate thing. So and BCorps are around the world, and benefit corporations are specifically in a number of states. My question for you is about your, if you have any thoughts on SASB, the sustainable SASB, which is supposed to look at sustainability requirements. They are trying to get materiality standards for sustainability. The SEC is not super happy about it for a lot of corporations, but I'm wondering if you think it's going to make a difference for investors as they look in sustainability and human rights in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the brightest spots on the horizon. So I've already talked about the historical story about how our original accounting system looks only at financial performance. And how we need, now that we've got companies that are so much larger, that are having so many more repercussions for the environment, for their employees, for future generations, we need to start coming up with a better system of truly keeping track of social costs and benefits. So I think that's absolutely the direction that we need to go, and I'm terribly excited that Michael Bloomberg has thrown his personal support behind this initiative. I'm disappointed with the SEC. If any of them ever look at this tape, I'm disappointed with the SEC that they are allowing what I view as simple intellectual inertia to stop them from embracing this idea. But I think that as we see increasing demand from investors, not to mention customers and citizens, for this sort of information, this is one of the things that makes me feel very optimistic. Let's just hope we can do it before we do too much damage. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Let's.
So there were historical reasons that changed the way that corporations were viewed to create this ideology. Yeah. Were you able to detect any of the underneath motivations? Was it, am I going conspiracy theory, or was it just accidental? And is that a clue?
You can go a little conspiracy. I'll permit a little conspiracy, and it's a conspiracy. Let's start and ask ourselves, who is harmed by shareholder value ideology? Well, I've already argued diversified long-term shareholders, they're harmed. Employees are harmed. Customers sometimes are harmed. People who live in the community are harmed. The environment is harmed. Future generations are harmed. All right, so now we've got to say who wins. It's pretty much two groups. It's the short-term, non-diversified investors, and that is pretty much hedge funds. And it is CEOs who are compensated according to short-term shareholder returns. The group that's sort of caught in the middle is the pension funds. And they're really caught in a true investing tragedy of the commons. I think that most institutional investors, and they're starting to realize this, understand that investing with dynamite, backing hedge funds that go out and take a position in DuPont and then push for DuPont to split itself up because they know it'll get a short-term share price. In the meantime, DuPont is trying to address this by cutting back on payroll, cutting back on R&D. The investment funds that happen to own DuPont might make a temporary profit. But at the end of the day, a company like DuPont is going to end up being a shadow of itself and may eventually disappear the way Kodak did, the way Motorola pretty much has. And what happens if you're an institutional investor is you're watching all those companies disappear, you go, now what are we going to invest in? So the institutions are really caught in an investing tragedy of the commons. They need to find a way to work together and say, look, if we're going to be involved in corporate governance, we need to be involved in corporate governance in a way that creates sustainable value in the corporate sector as a whole. But when we look at the people who actually really do benefit from this, it's two small groups, but boy, are they politically powerful. Boy, are they politically powerful. CEOs and hedge funds. I mean, isn't that the group that you want supporting your political campaign? They've got plenty of money and they're willing to spend it. And by the way, I just want to say, I like CEOs. I've met some really, seriously, I've met some really fabulous people who are CEOs. They're often very selfless. I mean, think of what these people do. I mean, they give up their lives to run these companies. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a typical CEO has 80% of her wealth tied up in the shares of the company because she's been compensated that way for many years. Typical CEO has 80% of her compensation driven by shareholder returns. Typical CEO has an expected remaining life expectancy as a CEO of only 3 years. Average tenure is only 6 years, so if you're in the middle of that, you've got 3 years left to go. You know that maximizing shareholder value is what's going to maximize your value. You also know that if you try and draw the line and say, no, I don't want to fire employees, I don't want to cut back on R&D, you are probably going to be excoriated in the press. Sticking up for a managerialist philosophy is one of the most thankless jobs in the world. So why should we be surprised that fewer and fewer CEOs seem to want to take that on? So, they're a powerful interest group, but I think that in a lot of ways we've structured modern corporate practice, especially pay practice, so it's asking too much of them to do anything else.
Let's thank Professor Stout for an illuminating